Who do we know who came up with that name? It doesn't feel like a grothism somehow.
That the title of the exhibit was invented by Dale Yarborough.
Just I've always been curious about that because it just appeared. I mean, it was for like a year. I feel like they were like, we're gonna do this big show of alternative comic art, and then it was like it's called Misfit Lit, and we were all like, oh, like I'm suck. Uh,
Yeah, and again, that sort of reflects Gary's taste that he sees that comics are saw comics as a form of literature, something that's published on paper and has a narrative. But I I think just thought it sounded cool. It had a nice little rhyme and everything, so that's what we went with.
Yeah. Welcome to the Dummy Show. I'm John Kelly, publisher of Dummy, my printed publication of comics history that you can get at DummyZine.com. That's DummyZine.com. In this episode, we look at Misfit Lit, the historic 1991 exhibit of contemporary cartoonists that opened at a space called COCA, or the Center on Contemporary Art in Seattle, before traveling to several other locations in the United States, Canada, and even Portugal. I talked to some of the artists who had work in the exhibit, including Jim Woodring, Peter Bagge, Roberta Gregory, and Dan Clowes, who also did the art for the same art for the cover of the catalog. I also talked to Robert Boyd, who was a Fantagraphics employee at the time and who produced the catalog, and to Larry Reid, a longtime Fantagraphics employee who at the time was running the Coca space and was heavily involved in the local Seattle arts community. I didn't see the Misfit Lit exhibit myself. I was living in New York at the time, and the show didn't travel to New York. But around the time of the show, maybe a year or so afterwards, I was in Seattle, and Peter Bagge gave me one of his copies of the catalog, and I've been very interested in the show since, especially since I've gotten to know a bunch of the people who were, exhibited in the show or who helped, put it on. Looking at the list of the people whose work was exhibited in the show, and in talking to some of those people, you could see that it was a real jam-packed, full exhibit of really exciting art at a time when shows like this were really not that common. Having artwork done by comic artists framed and put into galleries or museums was pretty unusual at the time. I make a reference to this in the episode, but about a year or so after the Misfit Lit exhibit, there was a somewhat similar show in New York City at a place called Exit Art that featured some of the same artists, but maybe it was more of a East Coast version of the Misfit Lit show. But again, it was unusual to see Bristol board framed and hung in galleries, even though today it's something that we are used to seeing. At the time, it really was not. I'll mostly shut up now and let those who are actually there tell you more about Misfit Lit on the Dummy Show.
Wow. Well, that was a long time ago. That was in 91. That surprised me to realize that. I thought it was later in the 90s, but my wife and I and my son were all living in the north end above Seattle in Montlake Terrace when all that happened. So I had some memories of people coming over to our house, and it was a different house. So my memories are unreliable, but I found this diary that I wrote.
Oh, you did?
I did.
I don't remember who asked me to do that poster. I feel like I don't think I met Larry till I came to the show itself.
It's just to give background on Larry Reid. He's off and on. He's always had something going on. He's a Seattle native, although he lived in New York City for a while. But when I first met him, he was the off again, on again curator of something called Coca, which was a really big, huge gallery space, stood for Center of Contemporary Art. And Larry was constantly getting fired um, since he was a self-destructive wild man. But he used to put on the greatest shows. A Big Daddy Roth exhibit, tied in with Hot Rods, Von Dutch and all of that, Barris. But it would be amazing. It would be great. And he would get Big Daddy Roth to show up for it.
In the spring of 1978, I opened my first art gallery in Seattle. It was called Roscoe Louie, the old hot rod language for right and left. I sort of invented this character. And that coincided with three really gifted cartoonists that emerged from the Evergreen State College. Linda Berry, Charles Burns, and Matt Groening. Mm-hmm. And I opened my gallery, and I was I knew them. I knew Linda and Charles, and it gave me an opportunity to exhibit their work, and they had their first shows outside of college at my art gallery. And through them, it was able to show the work of people like Art Spiegelman and Gary Panter and, a number of others. This was in the punk rock era. So it wasn't a comics gallery, but I didn't make any distinction between fine art and illustration and graphic design. It was pretty inclusive. So that was sort of my entry point to the world of alternative comics. Those three artists eventually moved on to greener pastures, but Peter Bagge moved here in 1987. By that time, I had a much larger nonprofit organization called COCA, the Center on Contemporary Art, and it was that sort of coincided with the early period of the Seattle music scene. When I first started showing, opened my gallery, I discovered that a lot of the artists and patrons also had bands. So I hosted a lot of music shows. There weren't a lot of venues for that, for what we called punk rock then. So I had my foot in the door for the early period of what would become Seattle's infamous grunge scene. At any rate, when I had this large nonprofit space called Coca and met Pete Bagge and a number of other artists through Seattle was a small town then, and we all knew each other. People like Michael Dugan and Mark Zingarelli, and there were just dozens and dozens of really gifted cartoonists here. Fantagraphics moved here largely because of Pete's presence in 1989 when I had this organization, and I convinced them to organize an exhibition of alternative comics called MISFIT LIT. And they gathered together about 100 of the national and international artists for this exhibition that opened in 1991.
And he put down a really great show called MISFIT LIT, which was all about the alternative and underground comics of the time. He got the Crumbs to visit. And there's a catalog tied in with the show.
Robert Crumb came up, Daniel Clowes, the Hernandez brothers, and it joined by people like Jim Woodring and Roberta Gregory and a number of artists that were here. Who else came up? Paul Mavrides. And it was a great celebration of alternative comics just about the time that that was starting to gain a lot of momentum?
Well, I just started publishing my Naughty Bits comics from Fantagraphics. I think the first 2 or 3 issues were out, and I was known for that notorious Crazy Bitches story that was in issue number 1. It was this cartoon or a comic that I drew as kind of pre-bitchy bitch. It was, I wanted to draw it in a style that was so wacky, slapsticky comic where like these women are reading Robert Crumb and going, why is he doing these things to women? And they're all getting upset. I mean, I was working at Fantagraphics at the time, shooting the stats in the darkroom for their complete Crumb comics. And I had thought, how can he draw women having horrible things done to them and he's still a beloved cartoonist? Is it because it's this screwy, Bigfoot, googly-eyed, cartoonish style? So I did a goofy, cartoonish style where these women get mad at this guy for reading Crumb, and they like beat him up and make him have sex with them, and his wife bites his dick off and everything, like, okay, like here's women. And then I'm in the background and I'm drawing it, because that's me, And boy, the shit hit the fan. I mean, for like a year, I was, oh, she's the woman that draws men getting their dicks bit off or whatever, and that was kind of like the hot news in, I think, the Seattle comics scene, because Crumb, of course, was a guest. And I remember when I met him, the first thing he says was, why do you hate my comics so much, in front of everybody? I mean, he's kind of a clown. And that was kind of embarrassing. But the show was a huge deal. I mean, I think it was one of the factors that started the Seattle comics scene at the time. I remember we all painted the Fantagraphics van. There were people from, everybody was on the Fantagraphics van. They still have it parked in their driveway. But
this is the diary. It's an old record book. And I have a big stack of these things that I've kept over the years. And here is my entry for the MISFIT LIT show. It says, this weekend, 3/15 to 3/17, was one to remember, I'll tell you. Friday, the 15th, was the opening of the MISFIT LIT show at Coca. I have more pieces, 13, than anyone else in the show, I think. Strange but true. I drove down to the airport to pick up Mark Landman, the erstwhile editor of Buzz. It was our first in-person meeting. Burne Hogarth and his sons stayed with us, along with Mark Landman. Burne was an ideal house guest. He played with Max, was courtly with Mary, and was avuncular with me. The night of the show, Gary and all of the luminaries, the Crumbs, the Bagges, the Bros, Clowes, all went out tout ensemble to dinner. I fetched Mark Landman, and we went to dinner with Denny Eichmann and the rest of the B team. Thence to the gallery in cabs. It was packed, and it only got more so. The gallery had hired a bodyguard for the Crumbs, who seemed to be having a perfectly lousy time. I, on the other hand, had a great time. The crowd was really scoping out the stuff on the walls, and I had the fun of watching people react to my stuff with enthusiasm. We stayed until 11:30 or so, and then took Burne back to the house, stopping at the Doghouse, a lamented Seattle institution, on the way. The next night was a panel discussion with Crumb, Pete Bagge, Los Bros, Paul Mavridis, Dan Clowes, Burne, and me. It wasn't much fun. Burne opened the proceedings with some deathly dull remarks that went on until Crumb fell asleep and toppled backwards off his chair. Then Burne dominated the discussion, insisting that the Bros expostulate upon their philosophical intentions and so on. And one thing that happened that I didn't record is Burne also got on Paul Mavridis' case and said, you have to have an idea when you create. Can you tell me your intent? What are you trying to do? What is your raison d'etre for this work? And Paul Mavridi said, well, I have to figure out whether I'm going to give a cartoon character a big bag of cash or drop him off a cliff. I thought that showed those two worlds beautifully, I thought. I made a few ill-conceived remarks. It wasn't quite torture. Finally, when a woman asked why there were no women on the panel, I surrendered my seat to Roberta Gregory, and then I accidentally locked myself out of the room. The next day, there was a book signing at Fallout. And then we all painted drawings and slogans on the white fantagraphics van. All in all, it was a great event. Crumb's lust for Mary, my wife, was a constant factor. It got me to wondering, if I were to go and, say, visit, Salvador Dali, not likely now since he's dead, and he were to urinate on my leg, how would I react? Probably I'd be glad, since it would provide me with grist for a spectacular anecdote. Of course, if Oliver North or Donald Trump were to do it, I'd be horrified and wouldn't tell a soul. At any rate, having Crumb, that great artist and American, drooling after my wife is something I can live with. That's it.
The space, the Center for Contemporary Arts, was in a fantastically huge old building in downtown Seattle, and filling it with art was actually kind of a challenge. This was like a cavernous warehouse-like space, and comic art is not very big. It doesn't have the same presence that most contemporary art does. It's it's like this big. So some of the artists produced really large pieces, which were more compatible with a full-scale contemporary art space. Like Gary Panther produced large paintings. Paul Mavridi has produced enormous artworks. And they were kind of the big, in my mind, the biggest pieces. The most important for like someone who didn't already know about comics art would walk in and see that right away.
I mean, today we just, take it for granted that there are exhibits or pieces of comic art, original art hanging in museums. And 30 something years ago, that was not the case. It was a little strange to see Bristol board framed and hanging on walls in galleries.
It's not the ideal way to perceive or to experience that art form, but I like it partly because, in retrospect, it shows us showing respect to it, as opposed to the way it's usually portrayed as disposable.
Right. Yeah, there was an exhibit at a place in New York City called Exit Art around the same time as this show. And I remember I was walking around with Art Spiegelman at the show and was asking him what he thought. And he was just like, it's just so weird looking at this stuff framed.
Yeah, it is. And it doesn't feel quite right. It's not a comfortable way to look at comic book art, in my opinion, even though I love looking at originals. And there's a famous art theory from the 30s written by Walter Benjamin called The Age of Art and the Time of Mechanical Reproduction. And one of the things he wrote about was that art had an aura of like a connection with an original person, and that made it somehow special. And that if it's mechanically reproduced, like published in a magazine or streamed on a computer, then that aura goes away, and that sense of specialness has to somehow be reintroduced. And his theory was that movie stars were a way to provide that aura to mechanically reproduced films. But another way to provide that aura is to put it in art galleries, because art galleries are kind of sacred spaces for art. and that's what we were doing.
Sure.
It was a way for us to ennoble the art that we love.
It's like it's funny, you have these memories of these things that are so unrelated to the actual event. And my main event was being at the opening in Seattle. And it was like the first time this had ever happened to me. This has happened to me many times since, but this very normal kind of comic fan guy comes over and he starts talking to me and he's just telling me about his comics and what he's interested in and all that. And I'm nodding along. Oh, great, great, interest. I was very happy to have somebody who cared about comics to talk to. And then he just kept going. And I was kind of making all the signals of like, okay, that was enough. Like I'm going to move on and talk to somebody else. And he kind of like cornered me, like I was against the wall, and he kind of like put his hand up and he just kept talking. And I was too like polite or scared or whatever to like just walk away. And I remember like after a while, I just stopped responding. And then I just started looking at the ground as he was talking. And then I kind of slumped. And by the end, I was like crouched on the ground, like in a huddled position while he was still talking to me. And I'll never forget it. Like it just didn't matter to him at all that I was basically like protecting myself from him.
And he didn't miss a beat.
Didn't miss a beat. It was absolutely not of any importance at all that I was like clearly wanted him to like stop. And I remember looking at people as they walked by with this look on my face like, please save me. And they were kind of like, I don't want to get involved in this one.
Well, if he's still alive, he's probably still having that same conversation. So
with somebody. Yeah.
himself, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. It was I've run into a few and they're mostly just like cashiers or something where you're like you can kind of go, okay, I gotta go. But this was really I just didn't want to. The guy had been so nice in the beginning. I didn't want to say like, okay, I can't stand this anymore.
That insane Dan Clowes poster.
And then the logo that Dale came up with is all these letters are from logos of different comics that some of the participants in the show were in, and that was all down to Dale.
It's a very handsome catalog. It's an amazing artifact of what was going on 34 years ago, and I'm very happy to have a couple of copies of it, actually.
Yeah, well, I was very proud of it. I put it together, and we got Rob Rohde to write a pleasant but fairly anodyne introduction, and then Kim Thompson wrote a little something, and then basically I scoured interviews that the Comics Journal had run over the past few decades and chopped them up into a kind of oral history kind of thing, and then a page for each artist in the show.
I think Jim Blanchard sent me. There's a source for
There's
that.
a source for the woman that was.
It was like an S&M magazine or something.
No, it's a album called Organ Moods. It was just like she had this great expression of just sort of breathless, like, oh my God, this is so I'm so elated by this organ music, and I thought that was great to apply to comics. And of course, to somebody your age, you remember this, but there were literally, it would be almost half the articles about adult comics, which are always about Watchmen and Dark Knight mostly, always started with bang, zoom, comics aren't just for kids anymore. Like that, I saw that 50 times. So it was like the ultimate cliche.
Well, what was the slogan that you heard in all of the reviews about the emerging fine art cartoons? Bang, pow, comics aren't just for kids anymore.
It was always in an article that was about comics that definitely were for kids too.
Do you still have that art?
No. Also, anything I did that was like non 8 ball, that was done to sell the art. That was like the way I made money off at the time. So those were gone immediately. I'm sure I sold it for $200 to somebody. Probably it was probably in the show and sold right after.
Right.
I can't even remember what I had in the show. I can't remember anything in the show actually.
Right.
But weirdly, when we did it, we didn't know what the art would be because the artists were choosing their own art.
Okay. Okay. So the images that are in the catalog do not necessarily represent what what was in the show.
No, they just are meant to be examples of that artist's work.
Okay.
Which is obviously a fault. A regular monograph would have images that were used, but we just didn't have that kind of time to. We wanted it ready when the show opened up, and we were getting art at the last second.
Yeah, I used to run a small comic art museum in Pittsburgh called the Toonseum, and I know all about that. I know about getting stuff in 10 minutes before the show's opening and putting it up. Yep.
I remember being at the opening. I remember Robert Crumb had a bodyguard I remember feeling very impressed. They hired like this bodyguard who was like the alternative culture bodyguard. It was like he was like, yeah, I used to protect burrows and it was like that kind of.
Wow.
Yeah, it was cool. It was fun. It was a very showy kind of thing. It's like, yeah, we're taking this seriously. And that was the first time I ever met Crumb and Aileen was at that show.
Yeah.
Let's see, they had a panel discussion. I think it was of the luminaries of the comics scene at the time. It was Burne, Hogarth, and Crumb, and Jim Woodring, and Pete, and the Bros. And somebody complained that there's no women on the panel. This was like 1991, so people started Roberta. So I guess I was like the only like local comic person that was like in the audience. So they were all telling me to go up on stage. So Jim Woodring relinquished his seat. So I ended up being the only woman on the stage. And when I got on, I remember like Crumb, he stood up and did this thing where he like tries to climb on, he has this like trying to climb on women thing. And he tried to climb on me. And I was like, okay, you got back at me, so.
And it was really a hell of an event. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that it was only in 1990. I mean, that it was as far back as 1991, because I had just lived in Seattle for a couple of years. And it was being included in this event with all these really well-established, venerable masters in the field. And I got to sit up in the panel, and I had no idea how to talk to people. So as I say, I made some ill-conceived remarks, and I did very, very poorly. And I was glad to get out of there and give up my seat to Roberta. I remember being terribly self-conscious and having small frictions with a lot of the visiting artists, people who kind of seemed to, well, I don't know. I don't know what it was. There was a lot of tension. I remember hearing Man Ray being interviewed, and somebody said, gee, it must have been fun to be a Dadaist and a surrealist in those days. And he said, no, it wasn't fun. It was very tense, very competitive. And there was a similar attitude there. I remember that a famous cartoonist came up to me and said, I understand that you've told people that you don't like to look at my work because you're afraid it will influence you. Is that correct? And I said, well, I don't really think that's it exactly. I think I couldn't really tell you why I haven't looked so much at your work. And they took offense at that. It was just a bad moment, but people had chips on their shoulders. Like I said, the Crumbs didn't seem to be having a good time. Other famous cartoonists who were there didn't seem to be having a good time, at least at the show. I did go out to dinner with that whole group and the Crumbs talked about their sex life in a very relaxed and open way. So this strange mood, which maybe didn't exist, and which maybe I'm just mostly in my own head, had more to do with the show than the social aspect of it. People felt they were underrepresented, that other people were overrepresented. They didn't like where their work was. They wished they had been on the panel. I don't know. It wasn't a super light-hearted thing from my standpoint. It was kind of heavy, actually. It was really interesting seeing Chester Brown's originals. There are lots of little revelations like that.
We had to do a stage event at the museum in Seattle. It might have been the first time I was ever on stage. I remember being like petrified. And it was a ton of us on stage. I remember I was sitting between Crumb and Gilbert Hernandez and Jaime, Pete, Woodring, many others were there. And Gary got the great idea of like, I'm going to have elder statesman Burne Hogarth deliver this little introduction to these guys. Gary knew Burne Hogarth, and he should have very well known that he would have hated our work.
Hogarth did not get what we were doing, but he knew art exhibits at least, so he was willing to participate.
And Hogarth was, he was the artist of Tarzan. He wrote some of the most incomprehensible how-to drawing books ever created, which I kind of love. And he was the ultimate old curmudgeon. You almost couldn't exist like him anymore. Like nobody like him is around. And I half admired him and half was like found him unbelievably irritating. But so he's supposed to give this little introduction, 2-3 minutes, and now we'll hand it over and you can talk to Robert Crumb. And he talked for, I think, 45 minutes, something like that. And the audience was just catatonic because they didn't even know who he was. They were here to see Jaime and Crumb and hear the voices of these young cartoonists. And he was basically talking about how all we do is pornography and it's disgusting and it doesn't uplift the human character. And as he was talking about, Crumb's pornography, I remember Gilbert just leaned over to me and he goes, "Isn't Tarzan supposed to be naked?" And I remember laughing so hard I was like dying on stage. And then in the middle of the speech, it got so stultifying. The tenseness in the audience was so immense that Crumb, like from all his years being in the Cheap Suit Serenaders, he kind of knew how to appear in front of an audience and like how to get them on his side. And so as Hogarth is sputtering along with this thing, Crumb just leans his chair back and falls over on stage, and everybody, and it kind of broke the tension. But
it was kind of your standard panel discussion, but I recall Burne Hogarth was kind of going on long-windedly about something, and Crumb purposely tipped his chair over so he fell like flat on his back on the stage in like a pratfall. And, people, they thought he died on stage, but it was just Crumb being Crumb.
He was a blowhard, Hogarth was. And I to this day, I have no idea why Gary thought he was so great, because his comics are terrible. And his art instruction books, they fall into two categories: how to draw naked muscle men and how to draw their clothes. They're dumb. They're art instruction books for dumb artists. And he was not an interesting artist, in my opinion. I just remember it was contentious. Mostly I remember his panel down in Los Angeles when we opened there, because there he got into like an argument with Mary Fleener, of all people, on stage. And when I say argument, I don't want to suggest it was like they're shouting at each other, but they were definitely from a different world.
But the moment we all remember is finally some woman in the audience raises her hand as Hogarth is talking, and she's like, I'm tired of hearing from Vernon. I'd like to hear what the other artists have to say. Like she thought his name was Vernon, and we just thought that was like the greatest thing ever. I remember like for years after that, if I'd run into Jaime, we'd be like, "Hello, Vernon." I literally, I think I was on stage and literally did not speak. I think it never even got to like where any of us had a chance. I think Crumb talked a little bit, and that was about it. We had like another 10 minutes after he was done.
That show was so popular, the Misfit Lit exhibition, that Gary and Kim wanted it to tour.
You went on the tour, didn't you?
Well, there wasn't much of a tour. I think it just was in Minneapolis. I think that was the only other city.
I think it went to a couple of different places.
The one in Minneapolis was interesting. I remember because I remember somebody like there was some other curator there or something who wanted Larry to put like Cerebus in the show, and I remember Larry's like, "What the hell is this shit? It's like a anteater with a knife. Why would I put that in the show?" I just remember some screaming. I feel like Reed Waller used to do Omaha the
Omaha,
Kid.
yeah.
I think he was bummed out that he wasn't in the show. And I remember he and Larry got into like a screaming match. That was fun. We didn't have enough of that stuff.
Yeah.
I also remember going up to the Fantagraphics offices with Jaime and Gilbert and J.R. Williams and a whole bunch of people, and we all signed those posters for each other. So I've got one that's signed by about 12 of those people.
Well, that's a great artifact.
It is a great artifact.
And yeah, it was. I mean, that probably helped Naughty Bits kind of take off, and because I was just in the first few issues, and I think that kind of helped it pick up and go on for like another 40 issues. And well, another thing I remember was there was the program, and I recall I think I'd had a couple of issues of Naughty Bits out already, and I remember I think Pete Bagge was saying something about his cartoonish style, and he was saying like, women don't do these in your face, over the top comic styles. And I was kind of proud because that was exactly what I was doing with Naughty Bits. I mean,
It was a really fun and intense time. I remember being awakened by the sound of people going through my recycling, looking for sketches that I had thrown out.
Around this time, you mean?
Around this time, yeah. And it was my first sense that I was like actually going to be able to. I mean, even though I was in this Misfit Lit show, I didn't feel like I was part of that established group of people who were really good at this. I felt like I was not exactly an outsider, but somehow peripheral to it. I just didn't feel that I had what it took to be in the center ring with all these people. And it amazed me the extent to which my work was being, the extent to which people were taking an interest in my work, and that I was actually getting ink and being interviewed and people were taking my work seriously. It was the beginning of that for me. And it was very surprising that it was happening to me.
Does that ever become normal?
Well, it was at the peak of my fame, which I guess was sometime in the mid 90s, or it was at least the peak of the interest in my work and everything, when I got the most offers, the most proposals to make movies of my work, the most, none of which ever came to fruition, the most Christmas cards from people. It was kind of heady. I really felt like a celebrity. And then
Coca, which Larry Reid was running at that time, he was an expert at like making every opening an event. So hundreds of people would show up, and hundreds of people showed up for this, and it was exciting.
And so that just led me to work at Fantagraphics, where I assumed the position of marketing and promotions director.
Larry wound up getting to know Gary Groth and Kim Thompson of Fantagraphics. And something that I always desperately wanted was for Fantagraphics to get some kind of a PR person, a marketing person. They never really had anybody doing that. And I thought he'd be good at that. He's already proven himself to be this excellent huckster. He's a P.T. Barnum of all things alternative and hip.
That was in uh, late 1991, October. And coincidentally, the month that I started at Fantagraphics, the album Nevermind by Nirvana was released. And that created this sort of international focus on Seattle. And it had been with the grunge phenomenon gaining traction globally. I had a little background when I was a cook. I did host shows with bands like Nirvana and Mudhoney and dozens of other Seattle bands, as well as national and international bands. And when I started at Fantagraphics, I sort of brought that experience to and that approach to marketing to my position. And it's set about to as closely associate Fantagraphics with Seattle's now internationally famous music scene. It wasn't contrived at all. That association and those relationships did exist. A number of those artists, including Peter Bagge and Dan Clowes, were doing record covers and graphics for local bands and bands on a label called Sub Pop. And I was very close to a lot of those artists and musicians and music producers. So I took that approach of music promotion with me to Fantagraphics, and it seemed to work really well.
Yeah, but it's interesting to look back at that stuff now 30 years later and just I don't know, think about like where comics were at that time and where they are now, and maybe it's not all that different. I don't know. But
Yeah, I don't know. It's the scale is different, but it's almost a similar kind of breakdown of society who's into these comics.
Oh, I think they're very, very different. I remember wondering if this throwing open of the doors to the world of respectability by comics was going to change things. And I think it really did. Not that it increased the number of people who really appreciate comics, but it took comics out of the rarefied ghetto that they had been in and said, oh, this is acceptable, it's art, and it's like rock and roll, you don't have to be super skilled in order to produce something that's worth reading. And that part about not having to be super skilled is something a lot of people took to heart. And the proliferation of stuff that we have now reflects that. Although there is also, last time I was at a con, doing that thing I hate to do, which is walking by all the people selling their stuff and not buying any of it, and watching their hopeful and then disappointed looks as yet another prospective buyer spurns them. I was amazed at how many really, really good artists are out there. People who can really, really draw. They're numberless.